So I'm walking my dog and I'm thinking about what we've done so far in this podcast. And I'm kind of going back to the main goal, which is I want to become an expert in product market fit. And I think that's why you are here as well. We're both investing a lot of time, frankly, listening to these episodes, doing these episodes, and the entire goal is clear. It's simple. It's we want to become experts on product market fit. So far, I think the way we've been doing that is interviewing these late stage founders that are well beyond product market fit and diving deep into some of the most interesting and insightful parts of their journey, which I think has been immensely helpful. What I kind of realize is, first of all, some of these founders, some of these companies, I mean, they're still early, right? We don't know if they're going to work out, if they're not going to work out. And we're taking all of our lessons just from kind of that sample. And I thought to myself, I really want to know how some of the biggest companies in the world found product market fit. Like, what did they do? Is it different? What's there to learn on that side? And, the reality is it's going to be hard to do interviews with the CEOs of those companies because either they're not here anymore or they're like, top 100 on the Forbes list and unlikely to sit down for an hour to do a podcast on, how they started their company 30 years ago or 20 years ago. And so I started thinking about, okay, what can we do here? Like, how can we go and get at what we really want, which is just that how, let's say Nike, which is what we're going to be talking about today, like how did Nike find product market fit? And so what I did is I actually there was an Acquired episode. Acquired is a great podcast that you may have heard of. And they did a 4-hour episode on just the entire history of Nike. And I recommend, by the way, that you check that out. I think it's interesting in its own right. Like if you want to learn the history of Nike with all the kind of details around it, it's an amazing episode. If you want to go even further, of course, they're basing it on Shoe Dog, which is an amazing book written by Phil Knight, the CEO of Nike. And that's 13 hours long if you want to listen to it. And again, you should listen to it it's an amazing story. What we're doing here is different. What we're doing here is we're going to reframework the entire story. First of all, we're only going to focus on zero to product market fit. The rest is just not what we're after. And second is let's reframework the entire story on just the steps that happened, just the events that happened that led from zero to product market fit. And so anyways, it's an experiment. Let's try it out. So we're talking about now the mid 60s, 1960s, right? This is when the story of Nike starts. And maybe just for context, because I think it's important to understand where things were at back at that point. First of all, there was no such thing as going for a run, like jogging, just amateur jogging as part of just general fitness, not a thing, right? So that didn't really exist. Of course, there was professional running, track and field, and it was a small market. We're talking about $100 million, $200 million worth of track shoes sold in the entire US. Today Nike is a $150 billion company doing $50 billion in revenue just themselves. So things have clearly changed quite a bit since then. But I think that alone is important. And just to go on a tangent here, I think, this idea of starting in a niche market, right? So the two founders ultimately are Phil Knight, who's the CEO, and Bill Bowerman, who was his running coach. We'll talk about how that all happens. But they didn't for once think about market size. And there's just such an emphasis these days on market size. I'm going after a big market. The reality is the most important thing is going after something that you deeply understand, that you're well positioned to win at, and where you can deliver clear value. So neither Bill Bowerman nor Phil Knight really worry about the market size of kind of running shoes when they start. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing actually for two reasons. Because first of all, the fact that it's a small kind of niche market means that there's probably a bunch of important but unresolved problems. And the second thing is that because it's a niche market, there's likely to be very few experts on it, right? If you think about a massive market today, there's a bunch of people that have worked in that industry that understand it extremely well. So your competition totally changes. These guys, Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman, were just uniquely positioned at this time. And the other thing I'll note is it's easy to forget this. I think these days, especially if you watch the movie Air, you probably know this, but back then the big guys were Adidas, Puma, and Reebok, Converse. These were already big brands, especially the first three. And so this was not a greenfield opportunity. situation, right? So the context is you got a little tiny niche market, which is like this track shoes market, $100 million, $200 million. And in general, if you think about sporting shoes and you count basketball and soccer and all these other sports, you have already established big players that have been in the game for 10, 20 years. So let's talk about, if you think about zero to product market fit, what's one of the most important pieces is like, how'd you come up with the idea? And this is where it's already interesting and where you're going to see like the way that we're frameworking this, because we're thinking about it from a how to get a product market fit perspective, is not chronological. The way this all starts from a chronological perspective is that Phil Knight has that like business plan, and this is like a pretty known story, so I won't get too deep into it, but Phil Knight writes this business plan about how he wants to do to shoes what others had done to cameras. The idea was that like Japanese cameras had taken over the US market. He wanted to do it with Japanese shoes. So he writes this business plan when he's an MBA at Stanford. And then he goes off and actually executes it once he graduates. He goes to Japan. He starts this like distribution company called Blue Ribbon, where he buys these shoes called the Tigers from this Japanese company and imports them and sells them into the US. And that's like a 10 or so year story. None of that, as far as I'm concerned, is a startup. That's a distribution company, right? If you go and you find a product in another market and you bring it to your market or whatever, you're an import-export company. You're a distributor. And nothing wrong with that. It's a legitimate business. But it's not really a startup. Like, you're taking zero product risk. You're not inventing anything new. You're not really even innovating. You're just taking a product and reselling it. And that's what he did for a while. So when does the idea for Nike actually start? It starts in like somewhere between like 1968 and 1971. And it's not an idea that Phil Knight actually has. The idea comes from, and we'll find out how the merging happens, but it's actually his partner, Bill Bowerman, who was a running coach at his university. And he trained, athletes for many years, especially track and field athletes, and was obsessed with the equipment, especially with the shoes. He has two innovations. One of them happens while they're being kind of the distributor and working with that Japanese company. And the first idea was changing the material of the top of the shoe from leather to nylon. That was his first idea because he realized that nylon would be more breathable, it would be lighter. So that's like step one. The second thing, and this is like the seminal story that you probably would have heard of, is that Bill Bowerman, 1971, is watching his wife make waffles. Like, believe it or not, right? He's watching his wife make waffles with a waffle iron, and he puts two and two together because what had happened at that time is that track and field, the track that he was on in his university, had changed from like, I think, concrete to polyurethane. And the shoes were not like responding well. The existing shoes were not responding well. So he takes this waffle iron idea and says, well, what if I put polyurethane in this waffle iron? What would happen? And that's literally becomes like the foundation for his new shoe. That's the moment where it goes from Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman running a distribution company, reselling shoes that are made in Japan by some other manufacturer, to putting a couple of ideas together, this nylon on the top and polyurethane waffle iron on the bottom, and creating a new shoe and manufacturing it and producing it themselves. And let's talk about that a bit, because while people will say it's all about execution, I can guarantee you that that's a complete lie. If you want, put it this way, if you want to make the NBA, you need to be talented for sure. But guess what? You also need to be tall. If you're under 6 feet, realistically, you're not going to make the NBA. And if you want greatness, if you want to make the NASDAQ, yeah, sure, you need to execute extremely well. But guess what? You also need an amazing idea. So let's talk about how he comes up with that. If you dissect how ideas happen, there's kind of four frameworks. There's the ones that are pretty classic, which is like scratch your own itch, right? So you have a problem in your own life and you solve that problem and you hope others have it too. There's creating a 10x product, which is like what Zoom does to WebEx. There's going really deep in an industry, deeper than others, finding real unsolved problems. So doing like this intense research, whether it's because you're an industry expert, you've worked in the industry for a while, or whether you do it explicitly as a founder looking for something to build. But you go deep in an industry, you find unsolved problems and you solve them. And the last one is kind of what Jeff Bezos did, which is you find this big trend and you kind of go in, it's kind of tops down, right? So like you see the internet growing and you're like, whoa, what can I build? And you go in. How did Nike come up with their idea? They used a few of these frameworks, to be honest. I mean, I think the most accurate one is 10x product, because you had an established market of running shoes at that time. Athletes were using running shoes. They didn't necessarily consider the running shoes an unsolved problem. What Bill Bowerman saw was an opportunity to create a 10x better product. It's just that simple, right? If you change it from leather to nylon, you get lighter. If you change the bottom, you get more traction. And all of a sudden, your shoe is literally 10x as good. You run faster as an athlete. But there were other parts of that too, which I think are worth mentioning. Like one is he was a track and field coach. So in a sense, he is kind of scratching his own itch. And, the lines are blurry. This is just startup land. Like kind of nothing's black and white. And I'll mention this, which I think is really important. Paul Graham talks a lot about this, which is you need to, like, if you think about it, so much of these stories have to do with luck. And it's this classic, like, you have to make your own luck advice, right? You've got to put yourself in the right situation and be curious enough so that when things pop up, you know how to take advantage of them. So if you go back to it, Bill Bowerman is in his kitchen watching his wife use a waffle iron, which to anybody else would just be a meaningless, other Sunday morning. But for him, he puts two and two together because he's so obsessed with running shoes. He's been obsessed with running shoes for over a decade that he sees the opportunity to use that in a new way in order to create a 10x product. So I think the lessons from there are, you got these frameworks, you got these different ways you can come up with ideas, but at the foundation of it all is you need to be deep into something. You need to be curious about something. You need to position yourself to spot these ideas, these great ideas when they come up. Now, I think one of the most interesting things about the story of Nike, of how Nike found product market fit, is that it's totally backwards. So if you think about how a normal startup, take anyone, take Uber, take Airbnb, take Snapchat, it doesn't matter, right? Take any of these startups. How do they happen? First, you have an idea, then you launch it, and you go to market and you get distribution, right? So it's idea first, then distribution, then go to market. Nike is the exact opposite story. Phil Knight effectively builds a go-to-market distribution machine for running shoes. And only later does Bill Bowerman, his partner, end up coming up with an innovative idea that kickstarts, a truly new company, a truly new startup. So by the time Bill Bowerman has this idea, Nike just effectively takes off because the distribution machine was so well built. Before we jump into that, which is how he did kind of your typical classic, how he did your typical customer discovery and how he made his first sale and these sort of things, let's talk about how he got Bill Bowerman in the first place, because that's another critical part, right? You have an idea. Now you got to go and you got to build some sort of a team around it. It could be some contractors. It could be a couple employees. It could be one or two co-founders. And that's the way that Phil Knight approaches it. So when he decides he's going to do, this is back when he's still doing this kind of distribution company, not really a startup, but he's getting into the shoe world. He goes to the number one shoe expert that he knows, running shoe expert that he knows, which was his coach, Bill Bowerman from university, that used to coach him in track and field. And he pitches him on this idea of becoming partners on this distribution company that's going to import shoes from Japan and resell them in the US. Bill Bowerman decides to join, and they go like basically 50-50. I think it's like 51-49 on the partnership. There's really kind of not, frankly, from a what can you learn from story, there's really only one thing, because the way that he convinces Bill Bowerman is kind of relatively simple. Like Bill Bowerman he's so into running shoes to begin with. He'd already tried to do a few kind of, create his own shoes. Like he was already playing in that world. And so he was set up for this, right? Like by the time Phil Knight comes to him with this idea, Bill Bowerman was like, yeah, let's do it. Like it's kind of that simple. But I think the important thing is, first of all, the importance of, like, if you just think about Phil Knight's strengths, he didn't know all that much. He had this business, kind of high level business mindset, right? In this business plan. He really was not a product guy. He didn't know all that much about running shoes. So he clearly is filling that gap. And I think that's critical, is when you think about who should your co-founders be, you've got to think about the company I'm building. What does it really need? Like, what are the core strengths? If it's a consumer company, you're going to have to be really good at marketing, as an example, right? If it's a B2B company, you might need to be really good at enterprise sales. What strengths do you have and bring to the table? And what are the gaps? And that's what Phil Knight does spectacularly well. I don't think he could have picked a better guy. And by the way, the true idea of Nike would not have happened without this other person. So literally critical to his ultimate success. The other piece is, in this case, it's pretty aggressive, right? 51-49. By the way, Bill Bowerman at this point, he's part-time, like he's a full-time coach, and he's going to just like part-time help Phil Knight. And Phil Knight agrees to give him basically half his company. I don't know if I would recommend that to a part-time person, but you've got to do what it takes to get the right people on the bus. Because had he not gone Bill Bowerman on the bus, none of this other stuff would have happened. The other thing I think is worth highlighting in terms of how to pick co-founders is a little bit different. But if you think about Nike ultimately is producing shoes. So they need a manufacturing partner, which is not like a co-founder, but it's a pretty similar relationship, especially like if you're a software startup, you're going to need obviously developers and they produce ultimately the product. In his case, what he needs is a manufacturer to produce the product. So he goes out to Japan, and this is again years into his distribution company. So he's got a network, but he's trialing a bunch of different manufacturers to see who is going to produce that true first Nike shoe. He talks to a bunch of them, and most of them are kind of like, they're like, okay, cool. Like, this is what you want made. Cool. Come back in 2 weeks, come back in a week, whatever. He goes to this one manufacturer. He gives them a shoe in the morning. He's like, this is the kind of shoe I want you to make. They go for lunch. They come back that same evening, and there's a perfect replica of the shoe that's made. So, of course, Phil Knight says, this is the partner I'm going for. And I think the key quality there that is important, clearly translatable for all types of founders is the importance of speed. That is so critical when you're thinking about who to bring onto the bus. Are they moving fast? Do they get the stuff done quickly? That's just it's more important than, the logos they have, the CVs, just about anything else, honestly. I mean, obviously you need a culture fit and these sort of things. You need high integrity, but speed is just so critical. You need to be able to move so fast in those early days to be adaptable. And so those people that can just put things out, that's who you want to work with. What would be the next step? Typically would be customer discovery. So how does he figure out? And in this case, it's a little different because he's selling running shoes. It's a market. It exists. There's people buying running shoes. Again, this is more like a Zoom WebEx. Zoom understands that there's a market for video conferencing. And really for them, it's about proving that they're 10x better. Same thing here. People are buying running shoes. Small market, but they're buying running shoes. The key goal is for Nike to prove that there's a better. So what does Phil Knight do? Like, the typical thing at this point is to sell to retailers, right? If you're a distributor, you go to a bunch of retailers like, hey, you should put my shoe in your store and you sell that way. It's not what he does. He's like, we're talking in the mid 60s at this point, like over 50 years ago. And he's doing the classic do things that don't scale. And he's, putting shoes like in his trunk of his car. He's running up to track meets and he's selling shoes one by one by one. And obviously it's super inefficient, but I think there's something critical here. Again, the two things that don't scale, obviously, but he's going right at his ICP, right? His ideal customer profile does track and meet events. They're a runner. Where are they? They're at track and meet events. Let's go directly to them. Can that scale? No, it can't. But to start off and to get a deep sense and understanding of their customer, there's probably no better way. And the other thing I'll mention about this, because Phil Knight mentions it, he says he wasn't a good salesman. He really wasn't. And I think this is important. But he believed in his product so much that he was able to sell like he'd never been able to sell before. He tried to sell other things door to door before and just failed miserably. But when it came to selling his running shoes, at this point he's selling, to be clear, Tiger shoes, but he believed in that product. He was great at it. And it was easy and natural to him. And so I think, again, that's an important thing is like, you do need to build a product. You need to get to a place where you truly believe, because that's going to come out. That confidence is going to give you the credibility that you need to display for people to actually buy from you. Another thing I'll mention, which is kind of related to this customer discovery phase, is at one point, remember, there was jogging as an activity wasn't a thing in the US. Bowerman goes on a trip to a track meet in New Zealand and discovers the concept of jogging. And he actually ends up writing a book about jogging and how this, should be a big thing. And there's this idea that we've talked about before, which is you have to be in the market to win the market. And it sounds so simple. It's almost like stupid, not even worth saying. Think about how that really manifests itself. Again, a normal person might go to a track meet. In fact, many of these people went to New Zealand for this track meet, and none of them really took to this idea of jogging. Certainly none of them wrote a book. Bill Bowerman did. Bill Bowerman did because he was so deep in this market that when he saw this, it resonated with him in a different way, which just goes back to it. First of all, you don't know where things are going to lead, but what you do need to do is position yourself to see these insights. You've got to be really deep. You've got to be really curious and spend the time to become an expert. This is, again, you're tying all these things together. That's why niche market is so useful, because there are few experts in that market. You can be the expert in that market relatively quick, see things that other people don't see, and leverage them to dominate, which is exactly what happens here, because he needs money to grow this operation. He's not selling software. He's selling real shoes. He needs to buy more inventory. He needs to hire more people, all these sort of things. And the world back then was so different than the world today. Like there was no, venture capital was just not really a thing. So it was a lot harder for him. I think it's part of it is just kind of interesting from a historical standpoint. But I think from the perspective of, trying to find product market fit, what is, I think, compelling is just how hard it was for him to raise money. So he would go to bank after bank after bank, and the banks would tell him, like, you're growing too fast, right? Because for them, what they wanted was more kind of profitable businesses. And because Phil Knight was kind of plowing all of his profits back into growth just to drive that growth, he really wasn't left with a lot of profits at the end of the day. So he was seen as this really kind of high risk endeavor. But I think the interesting thing is that just didn't stop him. Like, it just didn't stop him. He didn't even change his business model in order to fit what the financiers of that time wanted. He knew that it was all about growth, and that's what he kept pressing on. And finally, at some point, again, you have to be in the market to win the market. At some point, because of his relationships in Japan, ends up finding this company, this trading company it's called, that is going to do a deal where they're going to help him manufacture shoes, and they're also going to finance him. And he ends up kind of locking in this financing piece, which was actually pretty aggressive. He had to give him royalties and all these sort of things. Again, the details, like if you want them, they're in the book Shoe Dog. They're in the Acquired episode. All these things I'm using to build this. But the point was, it was not easy for Nike, even though, by the way, so Nike is a company that was just doubling year after year after year after year, literally just doubling. But it wasn't all that easy for them to raise money. Back then, it was because banks considered them too risky. I think today they might have had that same problem because people would have considered them too niche, right? Like they would have looked at, oh, the TAM is $100 million, $200 million of running shoes. Like, what is this jogging thing you're talking about? It's not even real. And easily, I could see VCs dismissing Phil Knight for that reason. And clearly, Phil Knight would not have stopped because it was clear to him that he was driving true value. It was clear to him that his customers really wanted his product. And as long as that's working, the rest is going to fix itself. There's one more thing on the road from zero to product market fit that I think is worth noting. Obviously, I think it's become pretty common that startups are going to need to pivot at some point, that some of the assumptions that you've made, some of the things that you're going after aren't going to work out on version 1. You're going to have to kind of change pretty drastically. So it was interesting to me to see that when Phil Knight starts making his own shoes, the first shoe that he decides to make are actually soccer cleats. And the idea is, look, Adidas is dominating the soccer market. Soccer, it's a global sport. It's been around for a long time. So that was one of the bigger athletic shoe markets at the time. And Adidas was making soccer cleats, and they were kind of crushing it. And so Phil Knight decides, okay, well, maybe we can make cleats, but instead of them being for soccer, we could sell them here in America as football cleats. So he goes and he finds this manufacturer in Mexico, and he makes the kind of first version of football cleats. They look pretty good. Like they look good. They seem good. They seem like they're going to be high quality, but they're made in Mexico, which is, warm weather. So he sells them here into the US, and he gets some pretty big teams like Notre Dame football team, for example, to buy them, sells thousands of shoes, and the cleats break. They crack under the weather, right? It's much colder in the US than it is in Mexico, and they literally crack and don't work under cold weather. The interesting piece there, which like in Acquired, they highlight this, which I thought was worth re-highlighting, is because at that point, Phil Knight has his distribution company. He's just starting this kind of startup idea and doing his own thing with effectively Nike. His first product totally flops. It's this football cleat. Like, it just totally doesn't work. It breaks. I mean, what? I don't think anything worse can happen to a athletic shoe than it breaking during the game. He could have just said, okay, you know what? This is way too hard. Let's just stick with this distribution company. He decides not to. He continues to believe, and Bill Bowerman, that they can produce much better shoes than what exists in the market today. And so they kind of just keep going, and they try a different shoe. Now, this is the point when we started, how do they come up with the idea? We're actually at that point now in the story. Like, we're in 1971. Bill Bowerman sees this waffle iron situation. He uses it to change the sole of the shoe to this polyurethane material. And he sells them to the University of Oregon football team. And so they wear it on their new like AstroTurf field, and it's a huge success. So huge publicity. Then they change the sole to a blue color just to make them kind of shine that much more. They take the boxes, they make them orange just to make them shine that much more. Again, these kind of small tweaks, right? You can think of those as small little tweaks. And frankly, they explode. Like, frankly, this is like clear product market fit almost right away. I mean, 1972, first year of true like Nike doing, selling Nike shoes versus the Blue Ribbon, the distribution stuff they were doing earlier. First year they do $3.2 million in revenue. Hard to get a clear example of product market fit. And the reason was, and again, I mentioned this in the beginning, is because of the way that the story happened, it was really flipped. Normally, again, you go idea, you go product, then you go distribution. And when you do that, it typically takes a lot longer than a few months to get to incredible, $3 million in clear product market fit. They had spent from like the early 1960s till 1971. It was almost 10 years. I think it's like 7, 8 years doing the distribution stuff, right? Being in the shoe market and building out effectively an incredible distribution system so that by the time that this new 10x better shoe was born, the first Nike with the waffle iron, with the blue soles, the orange box, and all these sort of things, it was primed for distribution. They knew exactly where to go with it. They already had the relationships. They already had the credibility, and it just took off.